When was the last time you remember that you actually got a personal, handwritten letter through the mail? Probably been a while, I'm guessing. Judy and I were talking about it and realized that probably the last time we'd actually written a letter back and forth to each other was back when we were in college. Those prehistoric days before email and texting and video chat and all of that. And we would write letters back and forth, and Judy has all those letters bound up in somewhere in the hope chest that she has, and I'm sure I have hers somewhere, but in my memory of my heart, right? How's that sound? Well, there's something special, though, isn't there, about a handwritten letter, especially in today's world with all the email and all the electronic media and things like that. It's very rare, I would guess, that you would actually get a handwritten letter in the mail just for the purpose of communicating and sharing with you. Yeah, we may get notes, and that's good, and cards with notes, or maybe a typed letter with a note written at the end, and that's good. But they still don't have the impact of a real live handwritten letter written to you for a purpose of just checking in, see how you're doing, and maybe sharing some things with you. Well, if it's been a long time since you've gotten one of those letters, I've got a good news for you today. We are going to open a handwritten letter written just to you and a couple other thousand people throughout the ages. But it's significant as we begin to come together and see what God has to say to us. We're going to be looking over the next several months through the little letters of John. 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John near the end of the New Testament. And I'm beginning a new series today, so this is a good Sunday for you to be here. And it's going to be called Walking in the Light, the Love, Faith, and Truth. And basically those are the things that you'll find talked about in the letters of John as he's writing to the early church. Now I wanted to give you a kind of an introduction to who John is and what's going on here. You see, John was a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus. He was the only disciple of the 12 that did not suffer a martyr's death, was not killed for his faith. Now, tradition says he was dipped in boiling oil, which was no fun, I'm sure, but that didn't kill him, and he lived on in order to be able to write some things down. He was the only disciple that probably lived to the end of the first century. In the early 90s, they think he passed away sometime in the 90s. He was the disciple in the Gospels that was described as the disciple that Jesus loved. He seemed to have a special relationship with Jesus. He was part of the inner three, the big three, Peter, James, and John. Those are the three Jesus selected, and they went up on a mountain in Matthew 17, and it's called the Transfiguration. And Moses and Elijah and Jesus appeared there together, and Peter and James and John were a part of that. He was part of the three that Jesus said in the Garden of Gethsemane on this last night on earth. He said, "Hey guys, come and pray with me." And they went over there and Jesus prayed. Now, unfortunately, he was one of the three that fell asleep, but he was still part of the inner three there. He was the only disciple that we know of that was at the foot of the cross in the crucifixion of Jesus. He was the disciple that Jesus looked down from the cross and said, "John, here is my mother." And he commissioned John to take care of his mother. And church tradition teaches that John did that. And he took Mary back to Ephesus, and she lived out her life there in Ephesus as he continued his ministry. So he was a special person. He was a very close person when it came to having a relationship with Jesus. He was an author. He was the one that God guided to write his big feature book was the Gospel of John. We've all heard of that. And that is one of the Gospels that many times if you're talking to someone new or they want to find out about Jesus, have them read the Gospel of John. He was the one God selected to reveal the events of the end times. He wrote the book of Revelation. And we're studying the letters of John last summer and through the fall. I did the Gospel of John. I decided to cover all the writings of John, do his letters this spring, and possibly, I haven't decided yet, but I'm thinking since he wrote Revelation, we might as well just continue into Revelation after this study and read through and preach through the book of Revelation, which I've never done before. So if you're a snowbird, you're just going to have to stay if you want to be part of that sermon series, all right? I'd love to have you all stay anyway, honestly. but I know that's not always possible. So John was quite an author, and we're going to spend some time reading over the letters that he wrote. And 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, they think are one of the last letters written in the New Testament era. So they were kind of those final words. If you had that chance to say the final things, this is what he would say. And that's what we're looking at in the writings of John. He had a purpose in writing. He wrote to a world. He addresses this to Christians. And they were living in a world that did not always treat them nice. In the beginning of that time, either the end of the 1st century, leading into the centuries that followed, there was persecution, would become more and more a part of living the Christian life. And Rome would become more and more opposed to this sect they called, this strange group which called themselves Christians. So he was writing to encourage them in their faith. He was writing to teach them some things they needed to know if they were to stand up against the persecutions and against the attacks on their faith. He was writing to warn them of some of the teachings and watch out for how some were taking philosophies of the day and some of the Greek mythology of the day, and they were trying to blend it into a religion that fit them and their purposes. One of those is called Gnosticism, that you may have heard of before. It was a sect of the faith that focused on a special knowledge. If you had a special spiritual realization and knowledge of Jesus, that's all that mattered. It didn't matter what you did in your flesh. You could do anything you want in your body because it was only the Spirit that mattered. And John in this letter, we'll see it today, emphasizes the humanity of Jesus, not only His spiritual dynamic. He wrote to a world where the culture pretty much dominated, and it was an immoral culture. And they were going further and further away from morality. He wrote to a world where people were opposed to a faith that declared one God and one way. He wrote to a world that in many ways is a lot like what we live in today. So we're going to open his letter to us. Today we're going to read the first 4 verses. And in these verses he lays the foundation for really everything else he says in the book. And we need it as a foundation for us in our life. So let's start John chapter 1. I'm going to be using probably the English Standard Version. Sometimes people ask what translation to use. Usually I use the NIV, which is in the chair there in front of you. Sometimes I use the New Living Translation. Today I'm using the English Standard, which is probably maybe one of the most recent versions of the New Testament translation. This is what he says. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. That's his opening words. And what he wants to do, he wants to establish it's not something that he made up. It's not something that he made up. He saw and he heard and he touched. Empirical evidence, they would call it. If you were to go into a court of law and you're the prosecutor, one of the things you would love to have is some great evidence. You would gather all the evidence. You would gather it all there. You'd bring it into the courtroom. But the most important thing you're looking for, especially in a criminal case, is an eyewitness. An eyewitness who saw and who heard and maybe was even at the scene and touched some of the stuff that went on. And if a prosecutor walks into the courtroom with a reliable, unrefutable eyewitness, he's probably got the case wrapped up. That's how important it is. Did you catch the impact of John's words? That which was from the beginning, it had the beginning with God, but he's saying, which we have heard, that we have seen with our eyes, that we have touched with our hands. What he's saying is not just personal experience from a mystical standpoint. It's something I dreamed up. It's something that I thought about. No, he's saying I wrote down what I saw and what I heard and what I touched. He wrote the Gospel of John, and that was a pretty good reference because he's probably writing this 20 to maybe 30 years after the writing of the Gospel of John. So, why such a big deal? Why does John want to start out by saying, you can count on this? Because back then, not everybody believed in Jesus. Why is it such a big deal today? Because not everybody today believes in Jesus. And it's good for us to know, to be able to say, look, my faith is not just a mystical faith. It's not just something that I've made up. It's based on some fact. It's based on some eyewitnesses, and they've written these things down so that we can know what really happened. So John shares that. And he's addressing problems of the day. He's addressing the philosophers. What's interesting, the philosophers of the day and even the Jewish teachers would many times speak of the divine, but they would never speak about the humanity. And John brings together the divine and the humanity of Jesus together. Jesus was both God and man. Is that hard to get your head wrapped around? Yes. In the beginning of John, the Gospel of John, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that reference to the Word there is Jesus. And then down to verse 14, he says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So John, in his writing, in his life, he wants to establish that Jesus was both God and man. And there in the opening verses, he doesn't use the first person. He doesn't say I. He says, we have seen. There are more than just him that can testify. We have seen and we have heard and we have touched. So John wants us to understand who Jesus is. And I could give a bunch of other scriptures that support all of that and things, but I don't have time. Just suffice it to say that John wants the Christians then, and he wants the Christians now to know that what he's about to share, he didn't make up. So he goes on in verse 2. And he says, now concerning the word of life, I'm picking up at the end of verse 1. Concerning the word of life, the life was made manifest, and we have seen it, and testify to it, and proclaim to you the eternal life, which was with the Father, and was made manifest to us. Now the reason I've highlighted these words and underlined them is that we need to connect those things that he's talking about there. Concerning the word of life, who's the word of life? Jesus. Concerning Jesus, that we need to understand that his life was made manifest. It was not just an idea, it was not just a philosophy. It was made manifest. It became real. It appeared. It manifested himself to mankind. Jesus was a real man. And then he goes on, and what's interesting, he says, we have seen it, we testify it, and we proclaim to you what? The eternal life. Now that's an interesting phrase. What is the definite article the referring to? Now, we have any Ohio State fans here? I know we do. Some of you even are willing to hold your hands up. All right, that's good. Football season, they're good. Basketball season this year, they're... But what does Ohio State usually refer to itself as? The Ohio State. So that they can differentiate themselves from everything else. That they are unique and special. What hit me about this, he's talking about Jesus. The life was made manifest. And we have seen him, we heard him, we proclaimed the eternal life. You want to know what eternal life looks like? You need to look at Jesus. What John wrote was a window to eternal life. And that's what he's declaring here in this passage. Look to Jesus. In John's day and in ours, all kinds of people are looking in all different places to find meaning and purpose in life. And many times they're looking in the wrong place. John said in his gospel, John 14, says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The words of Jesus. And no one comes to the Father except through me. And John declares right up front, the one I've seen, I've heard, it's the eternal life. John is painting a picture and opening a way for all of those who struggle with the idea of Jesus and the reality of Jesus through the evidence that he had seen and others had seen. And that's why it's so important for us to study these letters and to know what was written, to understand that he is giving us a path. He is giving us a direction. He's giving us, for those of you that have ever been out in a sterile bay in a boat, he's given us channel markers. And those channel markers are important because the sterile bay average depth is about 3 foot on a good day and a high tide. And if you are buzzing down through a sterile bay and you think, oh, it looks nice over there, we're going to go that way. And boom, right across there, it's not going to end well. All right? In fact, when we first moved here to Bonita Springs, I put the boat in the sterile park there, or where the Corsian Park is, and we took the river all the way out. and we saw what now I know is Carlos Bridge. I didn't know what it was then, but I said, oh, let's go over there. So we headed out over there without a clue. I thought there's water. You can get across. Guess what? You can. We got out, and this is, I look at some of these things I did. Boy, you were stupid. But I didn't know any better. Still don't sometimes. We had to literally got out, Judy and Heather and I, and we pushed our boat across the flats there, about a foot of water, until we finally got to enough. Why? Because we didn't know the channel markers. I didn't know you had to stay within the channel markers. And when you do get out of the markers, it's not going to end well. The other day I was standing at the boat dock, and an FWC boat comes up, and this guy gets out of it, and the lady, she was a lady officer, they start lifting parts of boats out onto the dock, Wow, that's strange, So we went out, and sure enough, he had a pontoon boat, and he must have been buzzing across there and went out of the channel markers, and it was about half sunk. All that to say, you want to know about eternal life? You want to know the way to heaven? Look to Jesus. Because if you get outside of the channel markers, you're in dangerous territory. And that's why John's writing this letter. He's writing this book. He wants us to know. Well, he goes on in verses 3 and 4. And he says, that which we have seen and heard, we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. And indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. And we are writing these things so that our joy may be complete. I like that last phrase. I'm sharing this with meaning, with purpose. I want us all to be together. I want us to have joy and inner peace, a fellowship together. He uses the word twice. The church over history has not served the word fellowship well sometimes, because now the word fellowship usually goes with a fellowship dinner, a potluck. And many of us grew up in that, well, we're going to have a fellowship dinner. That's the only way I knew fellowship was used. But what's ironic is that it's not really the way it's used in the New Testament. Paul's saying, look, or John's saying here, look, I'm writing these things to you so that's a purpose clause there, that's a purpose phrase, so that you too may have fellowship with us. Who's us? It's John and all the other Christians and all the other leaders. He said, I want us to be together in this. I want us to share a fellowship. And what makes a fellowship special? He said, indeed, our fellowship is with who? With the Father and with His Son, Jesus Christ. What a beautiful picture. John's saying it's so important that we come together. And if we look at that word fellowship in the New Testament, it's never used with potluck dinner. It's just not there. All right? But what you'll find is in the book of Acts and other writings, it'll say it's about sharing life together. The early church, they broke bread together, they prayed together, and they fellowshiped together. They shared in their needs. It's about giving money to help in the needs of others. And that's what they did. Anyone had a need, it says they came together and did that. It was sharing in even sufferings. Paul writes in his writings of sharing together in the fellowship of suffering in the book of Philippians. It's about gathering together as partners in the gospel. And John wants the early church, and he wanted us to understand that what you have here is special, because we are bound together through Jesus Christ and His Father in heaven. We must never forget that. And it means sharing all kinds of things together. And it's not about just sharing here, but it's about even sharing around the world. I want to close with an example. Last Sunday morning during services, I received a text from Alexandru. You remember Alexandru, if you were here in November? He's the young man in Romania that's taking supplies across into Ukraine. And we took up an offering in November to help him purchase another van so that he could do that. And they were able to purchase that van. And he sent me a text a couple of weeks ago and said, we're going to be praying for us, but don't let this be known because we don't want the word to get out. Don't put it on social media anywhere because they hadn't gone yet. Well, when they came back last Sunday, he sent me a video and the text. I want to share the text with you and the video. And the point is, we are sharing together in fellowship of the gospel. He said last Sunday morning, "Good morning, Pastor Jeff, back from the Odessa region. Unfortunately, there were missile strikes in the power grid that day in the area, but we are okay. A bit of a problem with the weather coming back. It was snowing, it was slippery. I did another short video with our visit to Bakhmut. The road that you see in the video has been taken by the Russians now, and there's only one more way of entering, but it's impossible for volunteers to go in. But we will do our best to help in the area." So in the video, you'll see a white van, and that's the van that you guys purchased through your gifts. All right? So go ahead and hit that for me. Oops. Just double click on the picture there. That should work. There we go. Nope. Keep going. All right. Here, let me try it. There we go. Those are the generators of food is what they're distributing to the people. And that's him there driving.
This is a good opportunity for the church to give a light for the people who don't know.
Це дуже яскрава можливість церкви бути світлом для людей, які не знають Христа.
Vedete att stunden
Getting ready to go to Bakhmut.
That's Alexander. They're wearing the helmets and things because they're escorted by the soldiers.
I think this is good here. Maybe somebody that helped us out bring aid in this part of Ukraine, in Bakhmut and other cities around. Thank you, and may God bless you.
So last night I texted him and let him know that we were going to show that today. And he texted back. It says, "Unfortunately, the road we entered into Bakhmut in the video is now being shelled by the Russians, and they are 2 kilometers away, so it's closed. The other road inside Bakhmut we entered in through it is also being shelled. In December, when we visited the children living in the basements, that place is also being shelled. So it's impossible for us to do another mission in the city, but we will help where we can in the area. Just read the news that an American volunteer just died in that road today. He was evacuating civilians." The reason I share that is it's just a great illustration of the fellowship that we share in the gospel, because he is there because of the Jesus that John proclaims, that he heard and that he saw and that he touched, and who is the eternal life. And we worship that same Jesus, and we fellowship together because of that. So let us never forget that. Let us never take for granted. Let us never just take it flippantly that Jesus died for us so that we can share His love and share that with others. We're going to continue with a few songs of worship. But if you've ever come to a point in your life where you say, I want to understand more about what it is to follow this Jesus, look one of us up. And we're going to, here in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a room that you can go to, and people will be there and to be able to share and talk with you about that. But it's so important. It's not just a story. It's not just made up. It's what was seen and heard and now is testified